What is applied ethics?
Applied ethics is the study of existing ethical principles in practical fields of human endeavor, such as medicine, engineering, business, law, and environmentalism. Applied ethics also extends to new moral rules for new situations, such as the rights of airline passengers and disaster victims, moral issues involved in human cloning, and consumer protection. In this sense, applied ethics is practical ethics. It is a study of ethics of practice. In addition, applied ethics can be more critical as it applies theoretical moral systems and moral theories to practices and fields outside of philosophy. Existing rules and behavior in a given field may be theoretically justified or criticized by philosophical ethicists. In some cases, new moral directions may emerge. Environmental ethics is a good example of the theoretical dimension of applied ethics.
What were Georg Simmel's thoughts on fashion and money?
Simmel distinguished between individuals' personal selves and social selves, the latter being necessary for functioning in complex societies. Both fashion and money had symbolic uses in this sense. Simmel believed that fashion was limited to life in cities, because, as he wrote, it intensifies a multiplicity of social relations, increases the rate of social mobility and permits individuals from lower strata to become conscious of the styles and fashions of upper classes. His view of money was similar in that he felt it can operate as an impersonal form of exchange, as well as having value. Through money, subordination and domination can be expressed, while at the same time money permits more freedom within society. Simmel was also aware of the disadvantages of the use of money in its ability to create special hardships and crises in social identity.
Was John Stuart Mill a socialist or a capitalist?
In applying the principles of utility to government and social institutions, Mill recognized the productive consequences of free markets. But he thought that public ownership of production might benefit a greater number by eliminating the extremes of poverty. He believed in democratic government, provided that citizens were well informed and it was not a simple majority rule based on emotions.
What happened in Athens after both Plato and Aristotle were gone?
Athens remained the center of philosophy until the Romans sacked it in 87 BCE. Much of our knowledge of Hellenistic philosophical activity comes from the 1st century BCE Roman writers Lucretius, 99–55 BCE, and Cicero, 106–43 BCE, and secondary medieval sources. Plato's academy became the new academy, which was devoted to critical work on the thought of other schools. This was the beginning of the skeptics. Aristotle's Lyceum, or the Peripatos, was first led by Theophrastus in 322 BCE. But after 287 BCE, it fell into decline until the middle of the 1st century BCE.
Is there a sharp distinction between Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals?
No, both Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals influenced the ideas of the time. Among philosophers, those who have endured historically as part of the present philosophical canon are limited to George Berkeley, David Hume, Thomas Reid, Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and Guillaume Battista Vico. John Locke is also strongly associated with the Enlightenment. Although he dates back to the 17th century. However, during their times, brilliant thought in other fields by writers and personalities such as Ethan Allen, Marquis de Condorcet, Denis Diderot, Jonathan Edwards, Benjamin Franklin, Baron de Holbach, Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Marie de Maistre, Charles Baron du Montesquieu, Thomas Paine, Joseph Priestley, Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, and Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, were part of the intellectual climate for philosophers, as well.
How was Plotinus' system of thought expressed in the Enneads?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, system of thought was arranged in the Enneads, which was made up of 6 groups of 9 essays. The first 3 groups are about the physical world and human interaction with it. The 4th group is about the soul, the 5th is about intelligence, and the 6th is about the One. Although Plotinus thought he was a faithful student of Plato, he in fact added ideas from Aristotle, the Stoics, and his own philosophical imagination. Plotinus divided the Platonic imperceptible world of forms into 3 parts: the One, intelligence, and the soul. The One is above everything that is, because it is the highest principle of being and causation. As a principle, however, the One is everything, in everything. Because the One is a unity, it has no thought or awareness, which requires a separation between thinking and the object thought. Paradoxically, the One is both completely ignorant, lacking awareness even of itself, but also, in its own way, aware of everything that it has created. After the One, there is intelligence, which corresponds to Plato's specific forms, taken as a totality. Intelligence has an idea for everything that exists. Intelligence also contains number, which corresponds to souls, and it contains original matter. However, there is not an endless multiplication of ideas because, As the Stoics proclaimed, every so often the entire world is destroyed.
How are psychology and philosophy related?
Up until the 19th century, no clear distinction was made between philosophy of mind and psychology. The science of psychology did not yet exist in its own right until the early 20th century. Early historical figures in the science of psychology, such as Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, are of interest to philosophers because their theories of the human mind changed ideas about human nature in ways that philosophers had to take into account.
How and why did Jewish and Islamic philosophy become part of the scholastic tradition?
Arabs, Berbers, and other Muslims invaded Christian Spain in the year 711 as part of their Islamic military campaigns. These military invasions were followed by a kind of colonization, which supported lasting cultural exchange. The Muslims were inclined to tolerate Judaism as well as Christianity because it was also a monotheistic religion of the book. That is, like both Islam and Christianity, Judaism had its own Bible with one God. As a result of the dual tolerance of Jews and Christian by Muslim rulers, the scholastic tradition, which was originally a Christian tradition, came to incorporate both Jewish and Islamic philosophy.
What are some highlights of Jane Addams' life that led her to found Hull House?
Addams' father was a mill owner and politician in Cedarville, Illinois. Her mother died when she was 2, while giving birth to her 9th child. Addams attended Rockford Seminary, a women's college, failed in medical school, and became depressed for a decade, during which she traveled throughout Europe. Along the way she visited London's Toynbee Hall, which was a young men's community that helped poor Jewish and Irish immigrants in East London by working within these people's neighborhoods. Addams resolved to duplicate this plan, and in 1889 she founded Hull House in the near West Side community of Chicago. Hull House was run and operated by women. Addams had long-term relationships with her co-founder and college friend, Ellen Gates Starr, and, later on, with her colleague Mary Rosette Smith. Addams' work at Hull House, and other settlement houses based on it, made her well known. She became a very popular public speaker. She was involved in the founding of other progressive organizations, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Former President Theodore Roosevelt asked her to second his nomination for the presidency by the Bull Moose Progressive Party in 1912. Roosevelt had served 3 years as U.S. President after 1901, and a full term after 1904. The Progressive Party strongly supported women's rights and suffrage. However, Adams became a target for intense public criticism when she expressed both pacifist and feminist views before World War I. Toward the end of her life, she dedicated herself to world peace and African American civil rights.
Who was R. Hare?
Richard Mervyn Hare, 1919 to 2002, was a professor of moral philosophy at Oxford University. And he later taught at the University of Florida. In his The Language of Morals, 1992, he argued for the prescriptive nature of moral judgments and their universalizability, or ability to be generalized. In Freedom and Reason, 1963, and Moral Thinking, Its Levels, Method, and Point, 1981. Hare held that ethical concepts are used according to logical rules that support the truth of utilitarianism. The utilitarianism propounded by Hare was two-tier, providing for both act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism requires that we do singular actions that will result in the best consequences, whereas rule utilitarianism requires that we follow rules that will result in the best consequences.
Was Aquinas able to solve the conflict between faith and reason?
Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, redefined faith as a kind of knowledge, rather than as a specific feeling or attitude of mind. As such, he said that faith fell between opinion and scientific knowledge. Faith was greater than opinion because it involved strong agreement, as an act of will. And it was less than scientific knowledge because it lacked factual evidence that could compel agreement. Aquinas thought that philosophy was reasoning based on existing knowledge or experience, leading to new knowledge, which he called the way of discovery. He held that philosophy was also the use of reason to confirm beliefs by tracing them back to basic principles, which he called the way of reduction. Philosophy becomes theology if the beliefs one begins with are based on faith. There are, in turn, two kinds of theology: truths in Scripture that are learned for their own sake, and metaphysics or explanations based on religious principles. Despite his theological idea of metaphysics, Aquinas did distinguish between philosophy and theology. For instance, in De Aeternitate Mundi, although he held the religious belief that the universe was not eternal, he said that it might be eternal based on philosophical reasoning. In general, apart from religious revelation, Aquinas believed that we get our knowledge from sense experience and our intellectual understanding of our sense experience. Did St.
What was Vico's new view of history as knowledge?
unlike the Cartesians, who dismissed history as a hodgepodge of fiction and unconnected facts. Vico thought that the historian can achieve more certainty than the scientist because he is studying the story of a world made by humans. He disagreed with Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645, Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and others, who began with the idea of a state of nature or some other way of positing a static, unchanging human nature. He was wary of what we would call anachronism, or assuming that words had the same meanings in the past as they do now, or that people have always thought the same way. Vico believed that historical events change human ideas. Vico asserted that every theory must start from the point where the matter of which it treats first began to take shape. According to Vico, the way the historian can discover the minds and feelings of those in past times is to decode their language, myths, and customs. For example, he believed that what are considered metaphors, myths, and fables at one time may have been the literal truth to people in the past.
What is Thomas Kuhn's paradigm theory?
Although Kuhn himself noted that he used the word paradigm in at least 23 different ways in the first edition of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. The core meaning is that a paradigm defines and prescribes how research is conducted in a science. And it also presents a picture of the world as studied by that science. During normal science, all practitioners are expected to work within the reigning paradigm of their field and extend accepted theories to new circumstances. There is widespread agreement on one coherent worldview in a mature science. In immature sciences, competing schools of thought have followers who defend the paradigm of the viewpoint they subscribe to. Paradigms are not absolutely true for all time and can be literally overthrown by the adoption of new paradigms.
Why did philosophers love Maimonides?
Maimonides, 1135–1204, provided a justification for philosophical thought in a religious context at a time when philosophers feared persecution from religious authorities. The problems Maimonides raised in reconciling Aristotelian philosophy or the best conclusions of reason at that time with religion brought into religion itself philosophical problems about the limits of knowledge and what ought to be concluded when reason has run out.
Who was Moritz Schlick?
Moritz Schlick, 1882–1936, is famous for claiming that philosophy was dependent on science, intellectually. He was a philosopher who studied with the physicist Max Planck before arriving in Vienna, Austria, in 1922. His presence was the inspiration for the mathematician Hans Hahn to inaugurate the discussion group of the Vienna Circle, which, in addition to Hahn and Schlick, at first contained Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, and the physicist Philipp Frank. Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, joined them in 1926. Schlick was professor of the philosophy of inductive sciences at the University of Vienna, while he led the Vienna Circle. He believed that empirical knowledge was not about the content of experience, which could not be communicated, but about the form of experience. He maintained that all genuine philosophical problems and questions were either mathematical or logical, or could be solved by scientific investigation. Schlick believed that this implied that philosophy had no subject matter of its own that was distinct from the sciences. However, unlike other logical positivists, he thought that ethics were practical and that moral goodness was simply whatever is approved by society. Moral obligation could be studied as what is generally required by society. His main works include General Theory of Knowledge, 2nd edition, 1925, and Problems of Ethics, translated, 1939.
Who were the Cambridge Neoplatonists?
The founder of the group was understood to be Benjamin Whichcote, 1609–1683. Whichcote called reason the candle of the Lord. Henry Moore, 1614–1687, Ralph Cudworth, 1617–1688, and John Smith, 1616–1652, were three further distinguished Cambridge Platonists. Cudworth was the father of John Locke's lifelong friend and lady of the household in which he spent his last years, Damaris Cudworth. Additional Cambridge Platonists of note were Nathaniel Culverwell, 1619–1651, Peter Sterry, 1613–1672, George Rust, d. 1670, John Worthington, 1618–1671, and Simon Patrick, 1626–1707. Whichcote, Moore, Cudworth, and Smith were associated with Emmanuel College. Calvinism was the leading doctrine there and they all rebelled against it. Henry Moore was the most intellectually active member of the group.
Who was Otto Neurath?
Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, was a polymath who had begun by studying mathematics in Vienna, earning a doctorate in the subject in Berlin. During World War I he was assigned to the planning ministry by the Austrian government because he had earlier written about barter economies. The Marxist governments of Bavaria and Saxony hired him to implement their post-war socialist economies. He was charged with treason when the German government took over, although he was soon released. In graphic design, he contributed to the Viennese Social and Economic Museum with his invention of isotype, a system of symbols for iconographically presenting quantitative information to the public. As a logical positivist, Neurath was the main architect of the Manifesto of the Vienna Circle. Along with Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, John Dewey, 1859–1952, and others. He advocated the Unity of Science project, which was to result in the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science that would unify language and method and interdisciplinary dialogue across the sciences. It was never published. Neurath's ambition was to render the social sciences as predictive as the physical sciences. His main works include Through War Economy to Economy in Kind, 1919, Personal Life and Class Struggle, 1928, Empirical Sociology, 1931, and Neurath-Carnap Correspondence, 1943–1945. As well as numerous articles in edited collections, as well as work on the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. Neurath was married 3 times and his last wife, Marie, carried on his isotype work after his death.
What was the Sidgwick's interest in the paranormal?
Henry Sidgwick helped found the Society for Psychical Research in 1892, and his wife, Eleanor, was an active participant. The Sidgwicks believed that the work of society could help confirm religious claims, such as life after death. They believed that an afterlife was necessary as a motivation for morality in this life. However, their investigations were inconclusive. Even though Eleanor believed that Henry communicated with her after his death in 1900.
What was Plato's metaphysical theory of forms?
Plato's major contribution to philosophy was his metaphysical theory of forms. Plato's forms were divine objects, known by the mind through thought. The practice of such thought was believed to provide the best life. The forms, like the primary substance of the pre-Socratics, were responsible for all of the things experienced by human beings and for the very existence and qualities of human beings. Animals, natural objects, and man-made objects. Indeed, the entire world of existence was held to be made up of copies of the forms. Even ideas, such as beauty, truth, and justice, had forms. Although to Plato it was viewing the mind's representations of the forms, not the actual forms themselves, that mattered. The forms were unchanging, perfect, and divine. Everything that humans could think, perceive, or imagine, and the existing objects of thoughts and perceptions, were but imperfect copies of the forms.
Was Immanuel Kant an important figure of the Enlightenment?
Yes, Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, was more intellectually influential in the 19th century and beyond than any other Enlightenment philosopher because he constructed a system of reason from which empiricism and the sciences could be derived. Kant thereby, theoretically, ended any residual tensions between rationalism and empiricism because his rationalism allowed for empiricism. In that sense, he was the epitome of the age of reason. Of course, for those who ignored Kant, the business of philosophy remained empiricism. Idealism, or rationalism, as usual.
What were the main themes and claims in classic African American literature?
Until the Emancipation Proclamation, 1862, the main issue was the abolition of black slavery. From the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement of the late 1950s that resulted in legislation against discrimination in 1964, the issue was discrimination against blacks and their social and legal exclusion from opportunities in employment, education on all levels, housing, adequate medical care, and fairness in the criminal justice system. At the same time, support for and construction of positive identities for African Americans was a central concern.
Who was W. V.O. Quine?
W. V.O., Willard Van Orman, Quine, 1908 to 2000, represents the apogee of 20th century scientific philosophy. In many ways he combined the best of logical positivism, pragmatism, and scientific empiricism. He was born in Akron, Ohio, and studied at Oberlin College and then Harvard. He earned his Ph.D. in 1932 and then became a Harvard Fellow. This allowed 4 years for research and travel before beginning his 50-year Harvard teaching career in 1936. His influence is considered monumental, and he has been highly regarded, even revered, as a person. Quine's main books are Word and Object, 1964, The Ways of Paradox, and other essays. 1976, Ontological Relativity, 1977, From a Logical Point of View, 9 logico-philosophical essays. 1980, From Stimulus to Science, 1998, Theories and Things, 1986. Pursuit of Truth, 1992, and Quidthetes, An Intermittently Philosophical Dictionary, 1989.
What was John Stuart Mill's formulation of utilitarianism?
Mill showed how the principle of utility can be used to account for individual action and collective values. As a consequence of individuals seeking their own happiness, the good of society as a personal goal might be a result. Social values such as justice, in Mill's account, do not benefit society as mere abstractions, but only if individuals seek them out in their own lives.
What is metaphysical idealism?
Metaphysical idealism is the position going back to the pre-Socratics and brought to fruition by Plato in the ancient world, that what is ultimately real is something non-material and not apparent to the senses. Insofar as God was believed to be both non-material and most real. All Christian philosophers were idealists, but the term is usually reserved for those who posited mind or other non-material substances and things as more real than matter in the natural world.
What was disturbing about David Hume's analysis of causation?
Hume attacked the scientific and common sense idea that there was a necessary connection between cause and effect. He argued that no matter how closely we observe one billiard ball striking another, there is nothing in the action of the first ball that makes the response of the second inevitable. Only through experience do we learn relationships of cause and effect. To say that an event of type A causes an event of type B is to say no more than that. In the past, events of type A have always been followed by events of type B. This is Hume's constant conjunction theory of causation. The mind relates causes to effects, and vice versa, based on past experience alone, which produces an association of the ideas of causes and effects with each other. For example, the idea of bread is associated with the idea of nourishment.
What is an epicycle?
An epicycle is a type of circular motion that is not observed but, rather, theoretically postulated. From the postulation, what could be observed became predictable, which was how it saved the appearances, or was consistent with what was observed. In the Ptolemaic system, the 80 epicycles were necessary to account for the different speeds and directions in the observed movements of the Moon, Sun, and 5 known planets. They also explained differences in how far the planets appeared to be from Earth at different times. The planets themselves were believed to move in small circles, which themselves moved along differents, or large circles. Both the epicycles and differents moved counterclockwise in planes approximately parallel to the plane on which Earth was situated.
What are some results of experimental philosophy?
Thus far, Bertrand Russell's 1872–1970 theory of descriptions has failed. At least one intuitive test. Respondents are inclined to blame people for what they do unintentionally, which, according to philosophers, they should not. Free will is also held to be compatible with determinism, which philosophers have assumed not to be the case.
Who was Isaiah Berlin?
Isaiah Berlin, 1909–1997, was renowned for his work on ideals of liberty in democratic societies. He was born in Latvia and educated at Oxford. He was president of Wolfson College, Oxford, from 1966 to 1975. He is famous for his distinction between positive and negative liberty and his criticism of Marxist ideas of history. Berlin was a brilliant and elegant speaker and delivered lectures on the British Broadcasting Corporation, often without notes. Berlin's major works include Historical Inevitability, Two Concepts of Liberty, 1959. Four Essays on Liberty, 1969, Russian Thinkers, 1978, Against the Current, Essays in the History of Ideas. 1979, Personal Impressions, 1980, The Crooked Timber of Humanity. Chapters in the History of Ideas, 1990, and The Sense of Reality, Studies in Ideas and Their History, 1996.
Did W. V.O. Quine practice what he preached about philosophical relevance?
No, and many have been grateful for this. As a philosopher, Quine has been criticized for his ivory tower view of the field and his claim that philosophers are not particularly qualified for helping to get society on an even keel. However, in real life, Quine was very involved in resisting Nazism. After he visited Germany as a Harvard Fellow in the 1930s and met the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, he reacted against the Nazis' incursions into philosophy, one of which was an avowedly racist mathematical journal, Deutsche Mathematik, by volunteering for the U.S. Navy. After he returned to teaching at Harvard, he organized symposia and talks for members of the Vienna Circle from 1938 to 1941, particularly for Rudolf Carnap. 1891 to 1970, although Carnap was later hired by the University of Chicago. Quine also helped Alfred Tarski, 1902 to 1983, gain employment at City College in New York.
Has anyone succeeded in refuting Anselm's ontological argument?
Many philosophers believe that Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, killed Anselm's argument with his claim that existence or being is not a predicate or a quality that a thing can have or not have, but Other philosophers continued to debate both Anselm's and others' forms of the ontological argument.
What is Confucianism?
Confucius, 551–479 b. CE, was born in Shantung, China, where he advanced from poverty to an influential administrative post. He was a member of the Jew. The literal meaning of Jew is weaklings, a social group of ritualists and teachers. Confucius and his colleagues and followers became members of the Jew Chia, the school of the Jew. They sought to develop and restore traditional ideals of concern for all living things and reverence toward other human beings by determining and following proper rules of conduct. In 496 Confucius left his position to talk to rulers about the Jew Chia's doctrines. During a time when warlords were chaotically vying for control of the declining Zhou dynasty, he sought to import moral principles and the traditional virtues into government. Confucius' thoughts were put together by his pupils in the Lunyu, or Analects.
What was William Whewell's fundamental antithesis of knowledge?
Whewell claimed that in every act of knowledge, there are two opposite elements, which we may call ideas and perceptions. Whewell was influenced by Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, and shared Kant's belief that scientific information is not a pure collection of objective facts in the world, but that a prior system of ideas is required to arrive at scientific knowledge. However, he did not go as far as Kant in locating the possibility for scientific knowledge wholly within the mind. That is, unlike Kant, Whewell thought that the world as it is known to human beings exists independently of human minds. Neither did Whewell go as far as the empiricists, who emphasized induction and observation, in what he called the sensationalistic school.
What was Spinoza's legacy?
Spinoza has acquired an almost saintly aura over the centuries. In 1672 he wanted to participate in a protest against the brutal mob assassination of the Dutch statesman and mathematician, Johan de Witt, and his brother, Cornelius. There was great physical risk in such participation. But the only thing that stopped Spinoza was that a friend locked him up. The 19th-century Romantic writer Novalis called Spinoza the God-intoxicated man. The 20th-century philosopher Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, called Spinoza the most lovable and noble of all philosophers. Spinoza is believed to have influenced the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, and the scientist Albert Einstein, as well as authors such as William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Heinrich Heine, Percy Bysshe Shelley, George Eliot, George Sand, and Jorge Luis Borges. Late 20th century naturalists, as well as those who advocate a mind-body identity, have embraced his work. His cognitive account of the emotions as expressing beliefs has grounded branches of contemporary psychology, as well as philosophy of mind. The contemporary playwright David Ives' New Jerusalem. The interrogation of Baruch de Spinoza at Talmud Torah Congregation, Amsterdam, July 27. 1656 dramatizes both the persecution of Spinoza and the concern of Jewish leaders that Spinoza's radical thought would disrupt the fragile acceptance of the Jewish community in Amsterdam. At one point in the play, the Spinoza character quips, "There is no Jewish dogma, only bickering." After Spinoza was excommunicated from his Jewish community, he could receive neither patronage nor any other employment. He therefore made his living by grinding and polishing lenses. The dust from the glass is believed to have fatally injured his lungs and been responsible for his early death.
Why is gender an important topic in studies of early modern philosophy?
Social and family life, generally, and ideas about the sexes were so different in the 17th century compared to our own that they should not be overlooked as an important background to the beginnings of modern philosophy. Interestingly, all the well-known 17th century philosophers Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Hobbes, and Locke were bachelors their entire lives, as were the great majority of their colleagues in philosophy and the sciences.
Who was Georg Simmel?
Georg Simmel, 1858 to 1918, was a philosopher and early sociologist. He was born in Berlin and lived most of his life there. Simmel wrote about a wide range of subjects, including ethics, philosophy of history, education, religion, art, and money. His writing style was digressive rather than tightly analytic, as was expected in German philosophy at that time. Overall, as a Lebensphilosoph, or philosopher of life, Simmel saw life as more than itself, in other words, more than the human biological organism and its processes, because it was productive, particularly in cultural creativity. Perhaps Simmel's most distinctive work was his Philosophy of Money, 1900. A subject that few philosophers have directly addressed, then or since. He also wrote about fashion.
What was Francisco Suarez's view of metaphysics?
Suarez defined metaphysics as the study of being insofar as it is real being. The idea of being was analogous to the similarities among things that existed. Suarez held that everything which exists is an individual, not capable of further division into individuals like it. Suarez' focus on the most general kinds of things that exist was echoed in Descartes' division of the world into mind and matter.
Did Karl Marx live in poverty himself?
Yes. After he was kicked out of Brussels and Paris for his revolutionary writing, Marx and his family found refuge in London. In 1850 they were ejected from their two-room flat in Chelsea for failing to pay the rent. They found cheaper accommodation in Soho, where they stayed for 6 years. In order to help Marx with an income, Friedrich Engels returned to work for his father in Germany. The two kept in constant contact, and over the next 20 years they wrote to each other about every other day. During this time, Marx sought to understand capitalism by reading back issues of The Economist, as well as journal articles, in the reading room of the British Museum. The Marx's fifth child, Franziska, was born at their Soho flat, but she only lived for a year. Eleanor was born in 1855, but later that year Edgar became the Marx's third child to die. The family owned very little, and some days Marx could not leave the house because Jenny had to pawn his trousers to buy food. But on some Sundays, they all went to Hampstead Heath for picnics. After Marx began earning money from his articles for the New York Daily Tribune, and Jenny's mother left her a small inheritance, they were able to move to Kentish Town. In 1856, Jenny had a baby that was stillborn, and after that she caught smallpox. Although she survived this illness, it left her deaf and badly scarred. Marx also grew ill, and he wrote to Engels that such a lousy life is not worth living. But when he had an outbreak of boils in 1863, he was consoled that it was a truly proletarian disease. Both the working class and the owning class have their own ideologies, which unreconstructed are the ideology of the owning class. That is, the owning class sees the world in a way that justifies their position. For example, in believing that all who have great wealth have earned it by hard work. The politically dominant class in a society is the class that economically controls the main means of production. In general, the ideology of any social class is the result of where that class is located in terms of the dominant means of production in its society. Workers and others need to realize that workers are human beings who become alienated from their own labor when it is merely treated as a commodity on which their employers make a profit. The short-term solution to this situation is for workers to unite and demand better pay and working conditions. The long-term solution is a historical process through which capitalism will destroy itself through its own internal contradictions. The erstwhile workers will then become socialist owners who are able to pursue self-fulfilling activities. Instead of merely laboring to survive from one day to the next.
Who were the key players in the theories and practice of them in the scientific revolution?
Some of the key players of the scientific revolution were Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473-1543, Ptolemy, 90-168 c. E., who was not of this period, but highly relevant to it, Galileo Galilei, 1564-1642, Johannes Kepler, 1571-1630, Francis Bacon, 1561-1626, Robert Boyle, 1627-1691, and Isaac Newton, 1643-1727.
What was Otto Neurath's main philosophical contribution?
First, Neurath thought that the only connection between language and reality was metaphorical, and he believed that, at best, language and world coincide only because reality is all previously verified sentences. This required a coherence theory of truth for each individual sentence. A sentence is true if it coheres with already verified sentences. Only the entire language system can be verified. Neurath famously wrote, "We are like sailors who on the open sea must reconstruct their ship but are never able to start afresh from the bottom. Where a beam is taken away, a new one must at once be put there. And for this the rest of the ship is used as support." In this way, by using the old beams and driftwood, the ship can be shaped entirely anew. But only by gradual reconstruction. Second, Neurath did not think that phenomenalism could provide a valid foundation for scientific language because sense data are subjective. His alternative was to propose that mathematical physics be used for objective descriptions, a doctrine known as physicalism. Furthermore, language itself could be described in the language of mathematical physics because it is material, constituted by sounds and graphic symbols.
What was William Hamilton's philosophy of the conditioned?
Hamilton called the conditioned something that has been described or classified, and the unconditioned things that are without descriptions or classifications. His philosophy was an attempt to create a balance between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Hamilton wrote that all that is conceivable in thought lies between two extremes, which, as contradictory of each other, cannot both be true, but of which, as mutually contradictory, one must be true. The law of the mind. That the conceivable is in every relation bounded by the inconceivable, I call the law of the conditioned. Hamilton held the theological belief that the infinite is incognizable and inconceivable.
How did Nicolaus Copernicus change the world?
Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, changed how educated human beings viewed the world by constructing the heliocentric theory of Earth's relation to our Sun. According to the heliocentric theory, which is now considered common knowledge, Earth and the other planets revolve around the Sun. This heliocentric theory replaced the Ptolemaic geocentric theory, which held that the Sun and other planets revolve around Earth. Copernicus became dissatisfied with the Ptolemaic system after his travels in Italy at a time when there was a lively revival of interest in ancient Pythagorean theories about the metaphysical importance of number for all aspects of nature. The Ptolemaic system was not mathematically elegant, but in Copernicus' day the Church subscribed to the Ptolemaic theory, because that was the description of the cosmos given in the Bible.
What was Hannah Arendt's political philosophy?
Overall, Arendt was a strong critic of totalitarianism and an advocate of individual freedom, offering distinctive insights. She believed that both fascism and communism arose under illusions of inevitability based on the lack of real political community in modern life. She did not consider herself an existentialist because she thought we are is a more important starting point for philosophy than I am. Her positive model of society was active citizen participation in ways that leave social and private interests out of civic identities. Arendt's analysis of the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann, in which she introduced the concept of the banality of evil, was very controversial for her criticism of how Eichmann's trial was conducted in Israel, and how Jewish leaders had behaved under German dictator Adolf Hitler. Arendt's last work was an examination of practical judgment in political contexts, in which she used the figure of Socrates, 460 to 399 BCE, to posit inner dialogues. Conscience, she said, had the role of supporting friendship with oneself.
Do philosophers from the different subfields cooperate and get along?
After postmodernism, many philosophical subfields split within themselves when interest in continental philosophy from France and Germany introduced existentialism, phenomenology, and deconstruction to the field. Academic philosophers became embattled in their own culture wars. Empiricist or mainstream philosophers defended both their traditional methods and established canon against approaches that were more centered on human existence and experience and cultural criticism.
What was Martin Heidegger's question concerning technology?
Heidegger's question was the same question that hangs over us at this time. Will technology destroy the world as we know it? But Heidegger's understanding of technology was unlike environmentalist thought that distinguished the artificial from what is natural. As part of what it means to say that the world worlds, Heidegger believed that technology was a process arising from being. Insofar as human beings are the custodians of being in their own being. Albeit without a full understanding of what is involved in their relationship to being. Technology, according to Heidegger, was an enframing force and process that emerges from Dasein's relationship to being. All beings are marshaled and regimented to present themselves as uniform types of objects, human activities and the beauties of nature are also enframed and presented back to Dasein as items for use or consumption. In Heidegger's terms, a particularly plaintive example of such processing is the redirection and artificialization of the River Rhine as a tourist attraction. As part of his analysis of the historical force of technology that has arisen from a distinctively human understanding of being, Heidegger insists that technology is not an effect of science, but the reverse. Science and scientific research are no more than the results of more general technological forces.
How did Isaiah Berlin oppose Marxist historicism?
Berlin did not think that impersonal or absolute forces could determine history. Apart from the free will of exceptional individuals.
Why was Adam Smith's work important?
Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790, defined the economic system of capitalism and at the same time founded the science of modern economics in his An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. He sought to answer the question of how nations grow richer. Assuming that human life would improve as nations prospered. He analyzed the importance of the ongoing division of labor in the industrialization process, and argued for free competition based on the profit motive. This would be a system of economic liberty or laissez-faire, let them do it. He argued that selfishness in acquiring wealth would result in better conditions for all. Through the invisible hand of the marketplace.
Who was A. J. Eyre?
Sir Alfred Jules, Freddie, Eyre, 1910 to 1989, was the British logical positivist who became famous for his language. Truth and Logic, 1936, which was followed by The Problem of Knowledge, 1956. Eyre's main contribution was to relate logical positivism to traditional philosophy, which in no uncertain terms resulted in a devastating attack on metaphysics, ethics, and religion. The attack was on the meaning of terms used in these fields and resulted in the claim that they were meaningless. Eyre was the Grote Professor of the Philosophy of Mind and Logic at the University College London from 1946 until 1959. And after that the Wickham Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford. From 1951 to 1952 he was president of the prestigious Aristotelian Society. In 1973 he became a Knight in the Legion of Honor. Eyre's publications include Philosophical Essays, 1954, The Concept of a Person and Other Essays. 1956, The Origins of Pragmatism, 1958, Metaphysics and Common Sense, 1969. Russell and Moore, The Analytical Heritage, 1971, Probability and Evidence, 1972, Bertrand Russell. 1972, The Central Questions of Philosophy, 1973, Hume, 1980, Philosophy in the 20th Century. 1982, Freedom and Morality and Other Essays, 1984, Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1986, Part of My Life. 1977, and More of My Life, 1984, as well as numerous articles on related topics.
What were Bernard Bosanquet's main ideas concerning social philosophy?
Humans, said Bosanquet, can only achieve their individual goals within communities, both individually and collectively. We all wish for those things that produce harmony where once there were conflicting desires. On a community level, this is the general will. Being ruled by the general will results in liberty. The general will is the foundation of the modern state that has as its aim the actualization of what is best for all of its citizens.
What was meant by reason during the Enlightenment?
Reason was considered a universal capacity of all people that was brought to fruition by logic and the knowledge of science. It required people to abandon superstition and oppressive institutions, such as absolute monarchy and doctrinaire religion.
Who was Mary Wollstonecraft?
Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797, is considered the founder of modern feminism in the West. She wrote at the time of the French Revolution and contributed to democratic ideas, generally, in vindication of the rights of men, as well as to arguments for the equality of women in vindication of the rights of women. She also wrote novels, an autobiographical travel essay, and shorter works on education.
What is materialism?
In a general philosophical sense, materialism is the doctrine that only physical, material things are real. In a political Marxist sense, materialism is the doctrine that economic conditions and transactions determine the course of history.
Did Socrates really exist?
Socrates of Athens, 460 to 399 B. CE, was both a real historical person and the main character in Plato's dialogues. In both modes, he perfected the methods of the sophists in rhetoric, argument, and dialogue. But as a character in Plato's later dialogues he appears mainly as a mouthpiece for Plato's abstract philosophy. While there is some controversy about how much concerning Socrates, the philosopher, was invented by Plato, there is stable agreement about certain facts of his life. All agree that Socrates lived the principles he taught. The most famous being, the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates' father, Sophroniscus, was a stonecutter from Alopic, and his mother, Phainaret, was a midwife. Socrates himself was fond of referring to his philosophical manner of discourse as a form of midwifery. In Plato's Meno, he uses this role to extract mathematical truths from a slave boy as proof of the presence of innate ideas in the soul, which are first acquired in a divine realm before birth. Sophroniscus was friends with Athenian general and statesman Aristides the Just, 530 to 468 BCE. Which helped Socrates become connected throughout his life with the leadership class of Athens. He served ably and courageously as a hoplite, infantryman, in the Peloponnesian War. 431 to 404 BCE. When he became absorbed in philosophical activities, however, he became poor. Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, was depicted as a shrew in later writings about him, but he cared for his young sons and asked his friends to provide for their Socratic education after his death. Socrates was condemned to death for not believing in the gods the state believes in, and introducing different new divine powers, and also for corrupting the young. According to the indictments related in Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, he died peacefully by his own hand, drinking a cup of hemlock in preference to the escape arranged by his friends, which would have resulted in a life of exile. He refused exile because it was dishonorable and because he had voluntarily lived in Athens and accepted its laws throughout his life. To desert his city so as to avoid death would be disloyal in his mind. Socrates said he did not fear death, because he knew nothing about it. If there were no afterlife, dying would be like falling asleep. And if there were an afterlife it would enable a higher stage of discourse, it would be heaven. Another interpretation is that Socrates did not have much to lose by dying, he was already an old man.